Parry Jones. I'm a director in the planning and advisory business in the UK, specialising in securing infrastructure developers the necessary powers to construct and operate their projects. This inevitably involves the contentious issue of property acquisition, as few infrastructure projects are ever built on land entirely owned by our clients or promoters. As such, I like to think of myself and my team as being the caring faces of compulsory purchase. The business of delivering compulsory purchase is pretty complicated, and it would take a lot longer than just the short 20 minutes that we have to go through it in detail. But what I am going to try and do is paint a picture of how this process originated, why it's important to many of us, and why particularly it's important to the projects that for those of us who are delivering projects on other people's land, and briefly outline how WSP supports this work. So, a quick bit of history. As every schoolboy and schoolgirl knows, Magna Carta was signed by King John at Runnymede near Windsor on the 15th of June, 1215. King John was a bad king. The Great Charter was drafted by the Archbishop of Canterbury to strike a peace deal between the unpopular King John and the leading rebel barons. It started a process to limit the power of the state and enshrine civil liberties for the people over whom the king ruled. Today, Magna Carta is still regarded as the greatest symbol of civil liberties. It was a blueprint for the 13 colonies when they drafted the United States Constitution. The constitutions of Australia, New Zealand, and Canada, except Quebec, reflect Magna Carta, as did those of South Africa and Southern Rhodesia. Evidence in its influence may be seen in most of the English-speaking world's laws today, and it's been described as the greatest constitutional document of all time. Magna Carta remains the longest-standing piece of legislation in English law. 800 years later, 3 clauses from Magna Carta remain in effect, and we'll be considering one of these today, the implications of Clause 39. What Clause 39 says is that no one may be killed, imprisoned, or stripped of his rights or possessions without due process being legally applied. So, we may all breathe easy in our beds knowing that our lives, liberty, and property are protected. But this presents those of us who develop infrastructure projects with a living, with a bit of a problem, doesn't it? How may we go about trying to build infrastructure projects on other people's land if the law says we cannot? Well, we can, because there is a due legal process. If there wasn't a legal process, we'd be forced to rely on negotiation alone and left to the whim of capricious landowners who may try to extort money out of us when we fail to hit upon a mutually acceptable solution. This would result in insurmountable risks in the shape of, perhaps, enterprise and social necessity being held ransom to private landowners, an inability to guarantee the completion of projects within their programs and budgets, and ultimately, it would lead to society itself failing to lift itself out of a low-tech agrarian economy with the provision of all the necessary infrastructure that's needed to permit travel, trade, industry, commerce. In other words, we'd be condemned to live in a perpetual pre-industrial world. And what few infrastructure assets did exist would probably be in the hands of just a few large feudal landowners. The due process we have is compulsory purchase, or at least the prospect of compulsory purchase. To borrow a phrase from President Teddy Roosevelt, compulsory purchase is the equivalent of speaking softly but carrying a big stick. We can attempt to negotiate in the sure knowledge that we have the compulsory purchase big stick, so that those who we are seeking powers over are required to consider our reasonable negotiations. Compulsory purchase is therefore an extraordinary power, one which appears to run contrary to the natural justice of things, and is a fundamental tenet of English law established over 800 years ago. And it's because compulsory purchase runs contrary to what now feels like an almost inalienable freedom that it's become of interest. It's a potentially controversial aspect of our work, and it's also captured the public imagination. In the days of the Yellow Pages, there was a joke when people used to say, "For boring, see engineering." It's certainly true that there are very few engineering references in popular culture. I'm thinking the bridge on the River Kwai. After that, I have to say I am struggling. But you add the ingredient of compulsory purchase, and suddenly there's a lot. Some of these you may be familiar with. If you're not familiar with them, I urge you to have a look at them. And maybe if you are familiar, revisit them and consider the compulsory purchase aspects. Up, that excellent film where Carl literally up sticks to move his house to South America. We might think about Charles Dickens' literary career, which coincided with the golden age of railways. Dickens' despair at the knocking down of his childhood neighbourhood in Camden to make way for Euston Station in London is reflected in Dombey and Son. The Long Good Friday is perhaps the greatest British gangster movie ever, and it follows the redevelopment of the then derelict London Docklands. Watership Down sees the rabbits move home when their warren is bulldozed to make way for a new road. One of my childhood favourites, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, sees Arthur Dent lying down in front of a bulldozer when his home is threatened to make way for a bypass, while simultaneously a Vogon constructor fleet demolishes the Earth to make way for an intergalactic hyperspace bypass. Withnail and I, a pair of out-of-work actors, go on holiday by mistake when escaping the redevelopment of 1960s London. In Local Hero, one member of a coastal community refuses to sell his beach to make way for an oil terminal off the west coast of Scotland. In the Sci-Fi District 9, this deals with a few uncomfortable truths about modern-day South Africa, with a slum in Johannesburg being cleared of an unwanted population of aliens. And in her song Big Yellow Taxi, Joni Mitchell lamented the loss of paradise which had been paved over and replaced by a parking lot. And then you might also think of Blot on the Landscape, where by Tom Sharp, a gardener unleashes a one-man war against some road developers. And then my own personal favourite, Sergio Leone's epic Once Upon a Time in the West, where a gang of killers are hired to get rid of landowners who refuse to sell, a brutal tactic that actually was employed in the rapid expansion of the railways across the United States. An often repeated tale, brilliantly parodied in the spoof western Blazing Saddles. If you know of any more, I'd be delighted to hear them. It can be argued that the Industrial Revolution was the cause of the legal advances that permitted compulsory purchase. It can also be argued that because Magna Carta stated that no one could be deprived of their property without due process, compulsory purchase was the legal process that facilitated the Industrial Revolution. Either way, what's not up for dispute is that the UK got there first. The 18th century Enclosure Acts passed by Parliament allowed lords of the manor to remove peasants from common land. The manifestation of this was a revolutionised agricultural production that gave Britain the patchwork quilt rural landscape that we enjoy today. It displaced people from their long-established homes and livelihoods in their hundreds of thousands, with 4,000 Enclosure Acts passed between 1760 and 1870, displacing about a third of England's population. Arguably, this was the cause of the Industrial Revolution: more efficient agricultural production and displaced populations moving to rapidly growing cities. In turn, this generated a need for private, well-designed, long-distance turnpike roads and canals. These facilitated the movement of raw materials necessary to fuel the industrial economy and to transport products to markets. They were facilitated by compulsory purchase, and people encouraged by the ability of one horse to be able to draw 30 tons much faster than road transport at the time, saw the golden age of canals, with over 4,000 miles constructed in a little over 60 years. But the real upturn in the use of compulsory purchase came with the advent of the railways. After the first passenger trains of 1825, railway mania followed. Today's parliamentarians might complain about the volume of work in considering just one HS2 rail bill, but in just 1 year, in 1846, Parliament passed no fewer than 272 railway acts. It was during this period of frenzied activity that the activity of land referencing, as we know it today, really became standardized, and I'll be talking about that later. Railway mania prompted Victorian social reformers to question whether things were getting out of hand. And as a result, by the end of the 19th century, compulsory purchase was also being used as a general social welfare to build sewers, clearing slums, and other social benefits. It was also used for military purposes during the First World War. And today, it's used to manage a series of aspects of development, usually managed by the appropriate Secretary of State or the local council, having the powers to grant or refuse these extraordinary powers. Further use includes the Leasehold Reform Act and other leasehold revisions that allow private leaseholders to compel their landlords to sell them their freeholds. And also utility companies have these powers. For instance, the Water Industry Act, although they can usually get away with using other powers as well. These extraordinary powers must be responsibly employed, and those who grant those powers are therefore eager to be seen to be going through due practice and ensuring that those who need to be consulted and involved in the democratic process are given a voice. This is at the heart of what land referencing is, the identification of those who are affected, and WSP has by far the largest team that provide this professional service in the UK. Land referencing facilitates the process of participation that balances the indiscriminate use of extraordinary powers and the achievement of social benefit. However, by giving affected stakeholders a statutory role in the planning process, it's also at the heart of why infrastructure projects take so long. It might be quicker and easier to get out a checkbook and just buy people off. But in the UK, we like to make sure, especially because taxpayers are often footing the bill, that there's a lot of transparency in the way that that money is spent. And an additional check might be one that's enshrined by the Critchell Down rules. These require that any acquiring authority offers the land that turns out to be surplus back to the original owner. And a further check is the attention given to the proper use of these powers. Compulsory purchase and the schemes that they facilitate are often controversial, and the collective public good needs to be placed in balance with the negative impact to private citizens. It's no surprise then that those are often challenged. This is particularly the case with large public works, especially after the 1980s, when many public works are delivered by private companies after the UK's programme of privatisation. And we need to make sure that that we're very clear that those public works are indeed for the public benefit, and they're not just lining the pockets of shareholders of private companies. For an organisation like WSP, which excels in the development and delivery of infrastructure projects, compulsory purchase is a process that is employed to deliver projects all the time. Anyone who's delivering a project that is situated on someone else's land is probably going to rely on some sort of compulsory purchase power, either actually used or carried out as this big stick to help negotiations. WSP has the largest team in the UK that specialises in securing these powers. The powers can be provided by a number of statutory instruments, and all must demonstrate that the disbenefit to the individuals to be deprived of their rights are comfortably outweighed by the public good that the projects serve. Perhaps the most obvious and the most famous are parliamentary bills. These provide a bespoke piece of legislation that gives the promoter all the powers required to build, operate and maintain massive infrastructure projects, disapplying any laws that might otherwise prevent them from doing so. Examples include HS1, High Speed 1, the Channel Tunnel Rail Link, Crossrail, the recently opened Elizabeth Line, the London Olympics, and HS2, all of them WSP mega projects. They're all carried out under what is called a hybrid bill, which provides public powers to a special purpose private body for the purposes of delivering a project. But being bespoke makes these very complicated. The bill for phase 1 of HS2 was the largest piece of legislation of any sort ever laid before Parliament. It's now followed by the bills for phases 2A and 2B. As I said, in 1846, Parliament dealt with 272 bills. Today, it struggles with 3 in a whole decade. The rules for hybrid bills are set out in the standing orders that are largely unchanged since Victorian times, but the Land Clauses Consolidation Act of 1845 meant that it was no longer necessary to have a bespoke act to build infrastructure projects. Instead, there could be an off-the-peg approach. One might be an order under the Transport and Works Act, and these were particularly popular for rail and light rail schemes, including Thameslink and other projects, most of the urban metro schemes built in the 1990s. But today, the trend is very much for designating projects to be nationally significant infrastructure projects, or NSIPs, under a development consent order, which gives powers under the Planning Act 2008. WSP has unrivaled experience in delivering all of these and is regarded as a DCO specialist. WSP's development consent orders include the Tideway Super Sewer, the A303 at Stonehenge, and the Silvertown Tunnel under the Thames. WSP's DCOs are now proving themselves essential as part of the UK's carbon reduction agenda with energy generation and transmission projects. The DCO process places special emphasis on the protection of affected landowners, whereas a hybrid bill, a parliamentary bill, say for HS2, must identify all those people with interests in land to be acquired or impacted. A DCO also requires the identification of anyone who is indirectly impacted. This means for a project like, say, Heathrow Third Runway, it's necessary to identify and consult not just those who are going to be displaced by the scheme, but also anyone whose property values are impacted by the construction and operation of the project, bringing in Heathrow's case, a large chunk of residential West London that finds itself under the flight path for the new Heathrow airport. Here are a few more projects that WSP has been involved in. HS2, involving the compulsory purchase of a route out of London and into Manchester and Birmingham with a swathe of land between those cities. It dominates the transport infrastructure debate in the UK, and with that sort of price tag, little wonder. Thames Tideway Tunnel is a super sewer, a massive tunnel across London, big enough to drive 2 double-decker buses down. It's close to completion, and when finished, it will stop raw sewage being discharged into the River Thames and bring the Thames back into legally acceptable environmental standards. And also the Elizabeth line just opened, the culmination of the Crossrail project, which some of us, like myself, joined 20 years ago, providing a west to east link across the capital that serves millions of commuters, as well as, importantly, facilitating urban regeneration projects along its route. And there are lots more projects that I could discuss, large and small, that WSP has delivered and is still delivering. WSP has the largest team of professionals operating in the specialist area of land referencing in particular, with about 250 of that industry, that's half the whole industry, working for WSP. These land referencers identify the land and the legal interests in it. At times, 1 in 20 of all UK's 20 million registered properties titles in England and Wales have been part of these investigations, with up to anything like 100 live projects at any one time. These typically geographically focused discipline touches on legal, property, planning, cartography, archival research, and data management, and is supported by in-house GIS, as well as our own web-based data management capabilities. Complementing this, we have topographical surveyors, land and property negotiation and valuation experts, and across WSP, we have all the disciplines required to deliver these complex projects, with the exception of specialist lawyers, which we leave to my right learned friends. If you'd like to learn more about these projects and our contribution to them, I'd be delighted to help you. Please do contact me. Thank you for listening. Are there any questions?
Thank you, Ashley, for your presentation. So just to remind the housekeeping items, the slides are available to download in the handout box, and also for the Q&A now, you can continue to log your questions in the question box, which is found on the control panel. I will start with the first question. Why, in your opinion, the UK system is so slow, and is it a bad thing?
The UK system is slow by international standards. The reason it's so slow is because we take a lot of time going through due process, as I've described. We like to make sure that this process is very transparent. Taxpayers like to know that their money is being well spent. We don't get the checkbooks out and just sign off, just buy land willy-nilly. There is a lot of transparent process involved. It's my view that that is a good thing, because it may slow down the delivery of projects, but it does demonstrate that we are adherents to a democratic, open, fair, transparent process. I think that's the principal reason why we are so much slower. It is sometimes frustrating, but I think the UK has a reputation for being a fair country, and in no small part that is because of its heritage with Magna Carta, and this is the price we pay.
Thank you. The next question is, it goes like this: there is a farm in the middle of the M62 motorway between Manchester and Leeds because the farmer apparently wouldn't sell. Can you explain what happened there?
That's true. There is a farm right in the middle of the M62, which is the motorway between Leeds and Manchester, and the motorway divides, and there is a farm right in the middle of the motorway. And if you Google farmer refused to sell, you'll notice that there are thousands and thousands of articles about this. I'm afraid it's simply not true. Compulsory purchase doesn't allow farmers to refuse to sell. So it would have been a failure of compulsory purchase, but compulsory purchase prevents that from happening. In fact, it's quite deliberate. The motorway deliberately splits because the farm happens to be situated in the middle of a bog, and that boggy land was not suitable for a motorway. So the farmer was allowed to remain where he was, although it must be pretty miserable being there where he is.
Thanks for clarifying that. The next question is, how does the UK's approach to infrastructure development differ from continental Europe?
Well, I suppose there are two principal differences. The first is that the UK is a small island with a largish population. Whereabouts, I suppose we've got about the same population as, say, France, and but only in half the size. So the typical experience of looking out of a railway carriage, for instance, in the UK, is when you look out of a window of a railway carriage in the UK, what you look at tends to be somebody's back garden. Whereas in France, it tends to be open space, and the rest of continental Europe, lots of open space. So we're a tightly constrained country for our population. So I think that has an impact. It means that we have less space to play with. Another difference is that we invented railways. We got here first. This is a disadvantage in some ways for us, because it means that we have a Victorian railway system. As I mentioned, nearly the whole of the British railway system was finished well over 100 years ago, and our railways are therefore they are a miracle, but they are a Victorian miracle, and that's why they're so slow. They don't like going around corners. Modern railways like to go in straight lines. So that's another difference. And I suppose the third difference is our adherence to Magna Carta and those freedoms. The English-speaking world has those. Continental Europe does not. In France, they have the Napoleonic Code, and that really is an approach that does typically involve getting a checkbook out and writing large checks and speeding up the process of delivery of projects, but at a financial cost, which seems to be acceptable to promoters and the public in France, perhaps to a socialist government, but into a more liberal democracy like our own, we like to spend our money being very fair, and that slows things down a bit. But that's a key difference, I would suggest.
Thank you, Ashley. We don't have additional questions. Thank you.
Okay.
We don't have additional questions, so thank you everyone for joining us today. Thank you, Ashley, for a fantastic presentation, really interesting. And if you do have additional questions, please feel free to follow up directly with the contact details shown on the screen. So have a good day, everyone. Thank you for joining.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.